So I'll start with just some words real quick about the class. If you have, if you're on a web camera and you want to see everyone, you can go up to the kind of, it should be your top right corner and hit gallery view. And that'll allow you to see most of everyone, though we've got about 39 folks on this. So you'd have to scroll across. A couple quick words about the class and a big thank you for joining us. Because of excuse me, the church still being closed to in-person meetings, I decided that I was going to teach a class on the Bible, but it would have primarily been lecture. And so I wanted to do something that would have been more engaging and more discussion based. And so I decided that Job would be a good class for us, because it would be a Bible study where we could kind of wrestle with some of the questions we're already asking. I've gotten emails from you and I've talked to some of you, and I know you're asking questions and wondering things. And I think there's tons of places in scripture we could go to wrestle and kind of ask God these questions. The Psalms are something I've been going through a lot lately, but I thought Job would be a really good place to ask these questions, because it puts them kind of front and center. But it's also just such a good story. I mean, Job is, I think, one of the highlights of, if you're just looking at from a literary standpoint, of biblical literature. And so what we're going to do through this class is read Job in context of the pandemic. But I want to lift up, this isn't a typical Bible study where we're going to kind of go chapter by chapter by chapter. Most of the sections are going to be more than one or two chapters. And so we're going to be looking at larger contexts. And so what I want you to be thinking about is, instead of an in-depth study of Job and what's going on, I want you to kind of think of it more in the questions it's asking and how it's seeking to answer those, or to push the reader to answer those. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see our syllabus.
Will just left the meeting, not on purpose. So I can pull the syllabus up while he's joining back in and share that on my screen. Just give me a minute. Of course, today is the day I don't sit in my office and have multiple screens in front of me.
I'm back.
Great.
I just left my own class.
Yep.
I was trying to show y'all my screen and that happened. I apologize. This is, as I say all the time, live on Zoom. So I want to show you the syllabus, which you should all have gotten. If you haven't, I want you to email me, will@palmacia.org, because otherwise you can attend these classes because you obviously have the link, but you won't get the handouts I've been sending. So the schedule is going to be this. We are going to look at Job broken up over 7 weeks. I'm going to reserve, if it looks like the quarantine's going to go on longer, I might extend this a week or two, but my plan is to do this for 7 weeks. And so the first week is today, and we'll look at the prologue, which is Job 1 and 2. Then there are these 3 dialogue cycles, which are basically discussions between Job and his friends. And we'll look at those over the next 3 weeks. And you can see the chapter breakdown: 3 through 14, 15 through 21, and 22 through 27. Obviously, those are a little longer than the prologue. And so we'll be asking much more broader questions in a kind of in-depth study we're doing now. Chapter 28 is this kind of meditation on wisdom. And then there's Job's summation of kind of what's happened. And then the last kind of section before the epilogue is this kind of prophet of sorts comes up, Elihu. And then God has a couple speeches, and then there's Job's responses. And then lastly, there's this very short epilogue at the very end. That's kind of the breakdown of what we're going to be reading through. I know this doesn't make sense as far as like reading an arbitrary amount of chapters each week, but this, I think, is the best way for us to talk about it in our current context. It'll give us kind of these enclosed sections through the book. The Zoom instructions are the same for every week. So once you have this, just save it somewhere, because all you have to do is click that link or call that number and you'll be on there. And then there's my email, if you're not on the email list already. And if you're not on the email list, you wouldn't have gotten the syllabus or handout already, but email me and I'll give them to you. So let's start. I just want to give a quick introduction to Job and then have us read the prologue together.
Real quick, Will, before you do that, we've had about 8 to 10 people join since you started. Can you, or I'll just tell everyone, if you've joined recently, everyone is muted. So if you need to unmute yourself, you can do it on your screen if you're joining through a computer, and if you're on a phone, hit *6. Don't leave. Okay.
I'm not. I left once, but I won't do it again. I'll leave at the end of it. How about that? Okay, so Job is a book you're all probably very familiar with. If you haven't read it all the way through, I'm sure you've read parts of it or heard lines from it, especially the prologue, and then chapters 38 through 41 are some of the most well-known biblical poetry, I would say. The book has been described as a saga, an epic. Alfred Lord Tennyson said it was the greatest poem of ancient or modern times. It's also been compared to a folk tale. I think one of the most important things to think about is it's a narrative. It's a story. And as a story, it invites us to kind of enter into it in a way that we wouldn't into a historical story, or maybe even something like, I'm trying to think of something like a prophetic text. So like a prophetic text is part history, but it's also part kind of vision or word from God. And Job is so much just a story. And I think one of the ways it has so much power is that story invites kind of everyone into it, regardless of it being, thousands of years away from our own time. I have this quote from Richard Clifford. Can everyone, can you read this? Yes, I'm seeing some head shaking. Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay. So Clifford says and this is well believed, that it falls within the context of wisdom literature. And Clifford says describes wisdom literature as personal, reflective, and didactic. It's about personal rather than national affairs. It ponders problems and quandaries. It hands on its reflection to others. Job ponders what today we call the problem of evil in a typically ancient way, treating evil not abstractly, but as embodied in the story of a human being. The book of Job discusses divine irrationality and injustice and their effects upon a particular man, Job. This isn't the story of some large country. It's not a historical story in the sense of it's telling you this historical story. It is a theological story. And as a theological story, it invites us into readers to kind of think of ourselves as Job and to contrast ourselves from Job. We kind of walk alongside Job in that. And because of that, it's long had a universal appeal. This is a book that's kind of extended beyond the realms of faith communities. So this book is near and dear to Jewish and Christian communities, but it's one that's also been wrestled with by folks that aren't believers or folks of other traditions, because it upholds these kind of universal questions about evil, suffering, what is the meaning of life, why does evil happen to particular people. I want to say those are questions it's definitely dealing with, but one of the central questions of Job is right here. More specifically, the book seeks to discern if righteousness and service to God can be had without consideration of reward and punishment. And in that sense, the book is kind of going beyond a rational explanation of suffering or evil. It's trying to say, can you love God despite the seemingly unrationality of life? Can you find a relationship with God that continues despite tragedy and suffering? In ways that few books do. I would say some of the prophetic texts do, and then obviously the Gospels with the Passion. Job confronts suffering in this way that's so on the nose. It's not skirting around it or asking it in this kind of simplistic or superficial way. it gets really into the grit of suffering and evil and the meaning of life. While Job kind of stands outside the biblical narrative because it doesn't have the touch points of reference to the patriarchs or reference to Israel per se, it is a biblical book. It's dealing with God in a way that is explicitly Hebrew. It's thinking of who God is in the context of kind of the Hebrew story. So while it is this kind of universal story, as Gerald Jansen says, it is thematically and perspectively standing squarely within the Bible. So as I just mentioned, the setting of Job is kind of this land far, far away that we don't know about. There is no geographical ooze to point to. It's most likely in a patriarchal or pre-patriarchal time. And what that means is it's essentially taking time, place in Genesis, kind of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, or not the first 11, in Genesis before Moses, before Israel is founded. So it's in this time you could think of Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, this kind of time that's historical and unhistorical in many ways. Why is this? Because there are numerous factors that point to it. Job has cattle and servants. That kind of points to that time period instead of later on when it would be gold and silver. There's clans that are mentioned throughout this, like the Chaldeans and the Sabians that are from this time period. Job sacrifices an animal on his own instead of having a priest do it. He has a long lifespan and other things. There is no firm consensus on when this book was written. As many of you know, ancient Israel told stories orally, many times years and years and even generations before they were written down. Most scholars point to this being written sometime between the 7th and 4th century, with most pointing towards the exile. That's when the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon. There's reasons to say one way or the other. Some folks say it's wrestling with suffering in the context of the exile. Others say there's no direct reference to the exile, and so you can't really know. For our circumstances, I don't think this is important. I think what's important is the story and how it's speaking to humanity's relationship with God. The book is by and large written in poetry, though it does contain prose. There are numerous literary techniques used throughout the book. Dialogue, the utilization of questions, irony, parallelism, chiasmus, which is kind of it'll reference something and then reference something kind of like that other down the road. The main point, as I keep saying over and over again, is this is narrative. It is a story, and that's kind of the frame of reference we should enter into it. I've been reading a number of commentaries on Job, and I found this from James Wharton. Hey, Aaron, would you read that? Because I like to have other people besides me, so I'm not getting monotonous in my voice. Would you just read that first and second paragraph under purpose?
Sure. James Wharton, in his commentary on Job, says, the function of Job from the time of its inclusion among the Holy Scripture of Judaism and of Christianity has never been to provide answers to the questions it raises. Rather, it has functioned for Jews and Christians alike as a means of keeping the questions urgent and contemporary for all who set out to honor and serve the God of whom the Bible speaks. Likewise, the function of this class is not to provide specific answers, but rather a place where we can ask and wrestle with these questions in the context of the current coronavirus pandemic. As Wharton says elsewhere, Job resounds with our cries of the heart and honors them as an authentic dimension of faithfulness. Faithfulness can be seen in the honesty of the questions we ask.
Thanks. So
sure.
I want you to think about the class this way. We are going to do a Bible study of Job, but I want this to be seen more as we are, like Job and his friends, having a discussion about our current context and thinking through it in light of Job and what's happening in that narrative. This isn't a class that is going to provide answers as much as it's going to prompt questions. I think you'll come to conclusions and answers on your own, but I'm not going to say this is what Job is about or this is the answer to these questions. I want that to happen through dialogue more so than me being a teacher saying, oh, this is what it's about. If you read 3 commentaries on Job, you're going to get 3 different kind of answers to what Job is about. If you read 5 commentaries on Job, you're going to get 5 answers. There's no kind of singular belief into what Job is about or how it answers specific questions. So let this be a chance for us to ask questions, to ask hard questions, and to feel okay with that, and to see that as a sign of faithfulness. I feel a lot of times Christians can almost feel timid in asking hard questions or think that that's being doubtful or unchristian. And I think the tradition of Scripture shows us over and over again that faithfulness looks like asking hard questions. It's asking them in a way that is honest and genuine, but it is asking them. So I am going to pull up Job 1 and 2, and I want us to read this. It's not too long, so I think it'd be good for us to read it. I can't see all of you, so I'm going to pick on people, and hopefully they'll be okay with reading. So how about this? Marcia Ryberg, will you read verses 1 through 12 of chapter 1? And Aaron, if you'll finish that chapter. And then Sally Waterstrat, if you'll read, let's see, 1 through 6 of chapter 2. And Faye Rousseff Baker, if you'll end chapter 2. And if you can't unmute yourself, Aaron or I will help you. So I'm going to go back to chapter 1, and we will start.
Marsha, I just unmuted you, so you're good to go.
Okay. There was once a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold feasts in one another's houses in turn, and they would send, now I've lost my place, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the feast days had run their course, Job would send and sanctify them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This is what Job always did. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? Have you blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land? But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord.
One day, when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell on them and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 columns. made a raid on the camels and carried them off, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword. I alone have escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another came and said, "Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house." And suddenly a great wind came across the desert, struck the four corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. I alone have escaped to tell you." Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground and worshipped. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. Will, who did you have next?
I'm trying to read.
Gotcha.
Oh, me? Okay, I'll start. On another day, the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them to present himself before them. And the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." "Skin for skin," Satan replied. "A man will give all he has for his own life. But stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face." The Lord said to Satan, "Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life."
So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Job took a potsherd with which to scrape himself and sat among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamanite. They met together to go and console and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept out loud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great.
Great. Thank y'all for reading, and sorry to just kind of pick you out. It's so different than being in the class where I can kind of gauge who wants to read and who doesn't want to read. So just beware that you might have to read throughout this class. I also want to say there's 47 people on this right now. And so most likely what I'll do next week is move the discussion to, you can have like breakout rooms. So it'll just be like 4 or 5 of you. But this week I wasn't ready to do that, and I didn't have a clue how many people would be on this. So we'll probably do that next week. But for now, I want to walk through the prologue and point out a couple notes. I sent y'all that are on the email list these notes. You can see there's a lot of them, and then some questions to think about. My kind of idea with the handout isn't something for me to necessarily go through in class, but rather for something you can look at after class, can get some more details than we might afford through our discussion, and then to prompt questions for you to ask with your family or maybe friends that you have that are in this class. I want to walk through and point out a couple quick things about the text. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and just kind of lift up some things that are going on. So the prologue starts as all prologues do to introduce the story, to introduce a character. And obviously the character is Job, and he's from the land of Uz. We've kind of talked about, or us, we've kind of talked about this is kind of like in a land far, far away. There's not a specific thing going on here. But we know that Job is doing really, really well. He's got 3 daughters, 7 sons. Those numbers in Hebrew signify completion or perfection. So automatically we're getting into the story and saying this guy's got it made. So materially he's doing really well. But there's also, in the first verse it says, that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. Fearing God is central in this time period to indicate wisdom. This is someone that is very wise, that has lots of understanding. And so not only is Job doing well materially, he's also doing well morally. He's a righteous person. So we get to this strange part, verse 6, and there's a lot of stuff in here that has been kind of misunderstood or misinterpreted for generations. And the first one is, it says, verse 6, one day the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord. So who are these heavenly beings and what are they doing? The Hebrew is Ben Elohim, which just means the sons of God. And I think the easiest way for us to think about it is angels. They're not called angels here, but they're these kind of beings that aren't God, but they're not human. And they're essentially part of this heavenly court or this divine council. And they sit with God. So the story has gone from earth up to heaven, right? To the court of God. And then there is Satan. Satan has been so misunderstood in the context of this story. The Hebrew is ha-Satan, and that means the Satan. So it's not a proper name. It's more a character. And the best way to translate it is the accuser. So this is not the Satan of the New Testament. This isn't the devil. That's really, really important for me to get across, because I think we're taking what we have and we're transposing it onto the text, and that's kind of anachronistic. This is someone that is in God's court that has, we could say, bad intentions, but it's not the devil. It becomes kind of a character for the devil later on. And in the New Testament, Satan is an actual person. But this is more just a character that stands as someone that accuses or instigates. So there's this kind of back and forth of rhetorical questions that are asked to each other. And so God says, do you see how blameless and upright Job is? Satan can't, the accuser, I'm just going to use the accuser because I think that's a better way to translate it. The accuser can't say, no, Job is upright, Job is blameless, but he challenges God with this question. Verse 10, have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? Literally, have you not just protected this guy from everything? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. So the accuser essentially answers God with a question, and this is the crux of the book, right? Are those that are upright and blameless in the eyes of the Lord upright and blameless because they have been blessed? Do they do it for motive, or do they do it out of the genuineness of loving God? That's kind of the crux on which this stands. So they make this wager, essentially. It's really important to note that while God allows the accuser to do this, God doesn't do it. So I'm really interested to hear what y'all think about this. Is God, this is kind of hard to read, right? God's essentially letting the accuser attack Job. But there is a delineation here to be made between God allowing that to happen and God causing that to happen, and they're different. So Job loses all of his property, his children, his material wealth. And if you go to verse 21, it says, he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So Job's Job's kind of passed this test, right? It seems like he's passed. He's not whining about losing. And I don't mean to diminish what's going on. This is a terrible thing. He's lost his family as well as his possessions, but he still maintains a kind of steadfast faith. I want you to pay attention to verse 22. It says, "And all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing." Hold on one second. It was getting really cold in my house. Sorry. Verse 22 is really important. And all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. And so the accuser comes back to God and says, well, you took all of his stuff, but you didn't hurt him. And so God again allows permission to essentially do something, but it's done on the part of the accuser. And the accuser, it says, verse 7, "So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and inflicted loathsome sores on Job from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head." I'm going to send you art throughout this class, but there's some, if you just Google Job, there's tons and tons of paintings from all time periods of Job, and some of them are really kind of wretched to look at. But you can imagine what it would be like to have sores from your foot to your head. And you have to remember, in this time, skin infections were just largely kind of grouped together as someone being unclean. So if this happened to him, he would have been socially outcasted, as well as just being physically sick. So Job's wife shows up in verse 9 and says, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." So here's the first kind of dialogue partner for Job. And dialogue is so essential to this book. It's a large part of this book. And she begins as the first dialogue partner. And her response is, "God did this to you. Curse God." And so he says, "You speak as any foolish woman would speak. Shall we receive the good in the hand of God and not receive the bad?" And now I told you to remember verse 22. Now look what it says here at the end of verse 10. "And all this, Job did not sin with his lips." So this is a little different, right? In 22 of chapter 1, it says Job did not sin. And this says he did not sin with his lips. So early commentators in the Jewish community and the early church said, Job is beginning to sin in his heart here. He hasn't said anything with his lips. And as you know, in chapter 3 begins with Job cursing the day he was born. So you're starting to see Job as this upright and moral man who is unaffected seemingly by his circumstances. And we start to see just tiny glimmers, or signs, I should say, that that's changing. And this is the first one, that he did not sin with his lips. And then the very end, we have Job's 3 friends show up. These are folks that will be dialogue partners for him. Big parts of the book, and they all kind of represent different kind of theological or philosophical standpoints on suffering and faith and righteousness. And there's this beautiful scene where they come and just sit in silence with him. And that's a Jewish tradition that continues to this day, called Shiva, or sitting Shiva. And it's typically over 7 days, and it's just to kind of co-mourn with someone, solidarity and mourning. And it's typically a time of silence and sitting together. I wanted to point out something about this ending scene. Verse 12 says, "When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him." So Job has had his material wealth taken from him and his physical appearance taken from him, as well as his family taken from him. And then at the very end, it says that they saw his suffering was great. The Hebrew there for great is the same word that talks about how great and upright Job was. So in the beginning, he goes from a great person to, at the end, just a chapter later, to a person that is enduring great suffering. And he enters in with, you can imagine the material wealth he has is almost like a clothing of his identity. And he ends this book essentially naked. He's kind of completely naked, and so that nakedness is kind of literal, but also metaphorical. I want to open it up for discussion now. I have tons of questions I have for you, but I think we'll have plenty of time to get into these over the course of the class. But I also want to make sure that we are having time for discussion. So we've got about 20 minutes left. So let me open it up. I think the best way would be to unmute yourself or raise your hand, and Aaron and I will kind of try to keep an eye out. So I see Barbara Escher raising her hand, and I'll unmute you now. Oh, now you're unmuted.
Okay. Hi. It's probably, this is the most obvious question in the world, but throughout my life as a Christian, when people say to me, how can you believe in a God who allows so many terrible things to happen in our world, in the death of children, the destruction of the planet, whatever? And my response has always been, and it's, you know, it's hard for me to listen to this accuser, because I have said God gave us the intelligence to figure things out and to work on solutions and to solve problems, and he doesn't, you know, give these horrible things and make these things happen for us. He gives us things that we can do to make things better. Sometimes it's not enough, but that I have never blamed anybody except people and, you know, and circumstances, but not Satan or an accuser. And that, for me, that's the hardest part of Job.
Yeah, I put this in your notes. I think one helpful way to think about what's going on there is the ancient Near East, when the story was written, was one that was ruled by these kind of empires that were headed by a king. And so let me share the screen, because this is important to bring up. So I am reading, where is it? Up here. Here it is. So this first part and the second part that kind of is a parallel of it, where God and the accuser are talking, it's jarring and it's hard to understand. I said the scene is based largely off the political structure of the ancient Near East, such as an imperial royal court or a divine council chamber. Readers of Job would have been more familiar with a singular person far away making a decision that could greatly impact many people's lives. James Wharton suggests two dangers confront us at this part of Job. One is that we will take the scene as a direct revelation of who God is and how God acts towards human beings. So he's saying we can't use this as a theological doctrine saying this is how God is. But on the other hand, we can't just dismiss it completely as an outmoded relic of an ancient culture, as if it had nothing to do with the God who confronts us in the pages of the Bible. So I think what's going on here, and this will leave room for us to talk about, but it's trying to make sense of why suffering is happening in a theological context. And so it draws in God, and the way it does that is it literally has a dialogue partner for God, and that is the emissary, the accuser. And so it's thinking about it in this kind of ancient Near East royal court context. So we have to kind of take a step away from that, because that's not how we see the world or how we see God. But at the same time, we have to think about that literary technique is allowing us to ask these tough questions. And so I think that's the point, more so than to take this as literal. This is how things are. Thanks, Barbara. Anyone else? You can unmute yourself or raise a hand. Am I missing anyone? Oh, Pam, were you trying to talk?
Yeah, I was.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I can.
I think the idea of being naked at the end is very much what we're feeling now, that we've been stripped of so many things that we were dependent on, whether it was just feeding or, you know, grocery shopping and everything. And it's forcing us to reflect on how do we really plan meals? How do we really prepare for this? What happens when some of our friends are starting to get symptoms and they don't know because there are not enough kits to find out whether they really have it or it's sinuses. So that stripping is what I think we're dealing with right now. And my second point is there's a wonderful fictional account of this time of Jacob and Rachel called the Red Tent. I don't know if any women have read that, but it's kind of fun. I've been reading that over this time, and it reflects on the period you're talking about before the Israelites sort of where they're in tribes.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks. There's, and if you have examples of, you know, I sent out William Blake's engravings of Job. There's I think 22 plates. There's a frontispiece and then the 21 plates. There's so much of this. So if you have ones that you really like, share it with me and I'll make sure to share it with the class. But yeah, I completely agree. I think we're seeing so much of ourself in this story. Life as normal was continuing, and then boom, out of nowhere, it just completely changed. And now we're sitting like Job and beginning to ask, why is this happening? And like Job, we have friends kind of from all angles telling us different things.
I just want to say one other thing. There's just also, we have such tremendous fear because like one of today's papers was talking about the CDC tests were actually contaminated by doctors walking through the lab without changing their coats. So when they sent these to 100 different health sites, they actually contaminated some of the health sites in the US. So they're finding these new facts, or they're finding facts about our food supply will be meat and pork and chicken will be really low because the workers are mainly migrants and they couldn't keep the distancing and they didn't know. So like 15% of the Smithfield factory is corona patients. So it's just like we keep being bombarded. So you really have to have your faith and have your hope. Okay, I'm finished. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I see you, Marcia. There's definitely a lot of change happening. And I think one thing, and I'm hoping this class will kind of allow these discussions to happen, is even when things get back to normal, they won't fully be normal. And so that's something we'll have to kind of wrestle with as well and think through the implications of that. But I think your point on hope is so important. And hope's another part of this. What does hope mean? And I want to reference St. Paul, hope against hope, and think about what does that mean in the context of this story. Marcia?
I decided I would use the Robert Alter translation, which you mentioned to me.
Yeah.
You have to have some pretty big bucks to buy the Robert Alter translation. It's 3 volumes just for the Old Testament, but it's very good, Will told me, I believe him, translation from the Hebrew. So when you were talking about Ha-Satan or Ha-Satan, I was going to share, because I thought that maybe this was an interesting take on it, what he says about that. The Hebrew is Ha-Satan. He calls it the adversary, and it invariably uses the definite article because the designation indicates a function, not a proper name.
Yep.
The word Satan, is a person, thing, or set of circumstances that constitutes an obstacle or frustrates one's purposes. Only toward the end of the biblical period would that term begin to drop the definite article and refer to a demonic figure. This Marvin Pope imagines Ha-Satan here as a kind of intelligence agent working for God, but the dialogue suggests an element of jealousy when God lavishes praise on Job, and cynical mean-spiritedness.
Yeah.
That was a take I'd never thought of.
Yeah. Thanks for reading that. I've heard it referred to as like you were pointing out, the definite article there is leading it more towards a role or a function more so than a person. And I've heard it say, like, if you thought about the FBI, it'd be like an agent's working on behalf of the FBI instead of like a specific person. But that's an important thing. And I think so often we come to this book and we just put it in as like Satan, and then we get lost going, why would God have a talk with the devil?
Exactly. And why would he let the devil have his way? It's really a different kind of a a picture that we don't have in our contemporary society.
Yep. It's much different, and I think it getting away from that leads us back to kind of the central part of Job and is wrestling with suffering and what does it mean to be faithful in spite of suffering. Thanks, Marcia. So did anyone else have just any comments or questions? I've got some questions I want to ask. If no one has anything, unmute yourself or wave a hand. Okay, I see Sarah Mickelson, and then Betsy, I'll get to you next. So Sarah, go ahead.
I wonder if, well, this struck me as an invitation to humility and a recognition that all things come from God. I think is really important to kind of meditate on, because if we find ourselves in good standing and in good reputation, dressed well, all of these things have found a way to disguise how dependent we are on the hand of the Creator. And I wondered that, this is a moment where we're invited, and I think the coronavirus has really done a good job of this, separating from us those things that we use as facades to each other, and put us in a position where we have to really come to terms with who we are, that isn't defined by our work or how we interact with each other, or how we dress, what we do, but invites us to stand humbly before God and understand our relationship better. That was my comment.
Yeah, that's really helpful, and I appreciate that. I had some of y'all might have heard this before, but a spiritual director, he's a Jesuit, and I've seen him throughout my life at different points of time, and I asked him one time, why does it seem like God is so close when we're suffering? And he says it's because you don't have anything kind of separating you from God. It's in that moment all the kind of chaff, for lack of a better term, is washed away, and you're confronted with kind of reality in its most pure sense. And sometimes that can be very hard, but it's at those times sometimes we most realize our dependence on God. Thanks. Betsy Brott.
Yeah.
Oh, hold on. All right. Okay, go ahead.
There were two thoughts that crossed my mind, and one was, I'm so thankful for you doing Job, because this has been a difficult time for me and for everybody in the world. And I guess for me, it gives me a little inspiration that someone like Job could have things out of control happening to him, but he still had a strong faith in God, and he didn't let all that take him down. And then the other thought that I had was, we need to be careful as we talk with our friends. I look at his 3 friends that came, and then I looked at Job's wife, what we say to other people. We don't want to take them down further. So it kind of makes me realize sometimes, even though I think you need to be truthful, but you don't need to take somebody else down that's already suffering, but try to listen and hear what they're saying and be supportive.
Yeah, I mean, that's seen right at the front, whereas friends don't start with conversation, but rather start with silence. And I think that allows a place where the conversation to be more real and more pastoral rather than just simply responsive. I want to say something about your first part about Job's faithfulness. I think it's really important for us to see that Job as a person changes throughout the book. He's not just this singular one-dimensional person, but he curses, he questions, he doubts, he wrestles with God. And I think that's what faithfulness is about. Because I think oftentimes we can just say, well, faithfulness is believing 100% of the time and not asking questions. And no one can do that, right? I don't think any of us have never doubted or asked questions. And so I really want to stress that I think faithfulness looks like asking and wrestling with these questions. And I'm not saying Job isn't faithful. I'm saying he's extremely faithful. I just wanted to kind of lift up, I think his faithfulness looks like that wrestling. So I think Bill and Aaron wanted to ask a question. And Bill, can you unmute yourself, or Aaron, can you unmute him? Because I can't find him. Oh, there he is.
There I am.
All right.
Real quickly, I may be somewhat echoing Betsy. for me right now in this study and in this virus journey, I'm more with the three friends being quiet. I don't have answers. Now, life circumstances, I'm in a retirement community that is close to saying we should never leave campus. Now, they don't police it. So in other words, I don't have the choice to go out there and if I want to protect my fellow residents, many of whom are very vulnerable. And as an extrovert and someone who loves discussion, it's been a new kind of experience of just sort of living with this experience. And of course, the airways are full of sound and I'm listening to less and less of it. There has to be some, but to me, I wish for this nation some spirit of listening to each other's pain rather than protesting and demanding and positioning and all of that. And I don't think it's going to happen, but at least for me, that's more where I am at the moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think that's a powerful statement. To sit in silence sometimes can be a very active and not passive thing. So Aaron?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, I don't know if anyone's watched the connection service yet this morning, but just it struck me how I was, you know, preparing for this class also this morning. But it just struck me the parallel between Kenny's sermon and questioning, you know, that it's okay to question your own faith and to question the truth, you know, what is truth? And I just, the parallels between your selection of Job and our discussion today, and that I think was really helpful for me in, you know, especially where we are today. What really struck me though, in addition to that parallel, was in Job, how the three friends come to him and they sit in silence. And I was just thinking that there are so many people in this current situation who are isolated and their friends can't come sit with them in silence. You know, we have to think of ways that we can be those friends in this alternate universe that we're living in now. And, you know, I think, Will, you do that on your midweek service. We sit in silence together, you know, things like that. I think it's important for all of us to really think through how can we be those friends. So that was just kind of something I was thinking of, but then also the parallels.
Thank you so much for bringing up. That's such an important point for Job, because Job is always referred to as Job and thought of as Job, but it is as much about the other characters in the book, whether it's his wife or his friends. And community is such an important part of how not only we get along in life, but how we deal with suffering and deal with times like this. And so community is an important thing to think about as Aaron's lifting up with how do we continue community in spite of social distancing, but also that we're not in this alone, that we are in this together, and that especially us here, we have a church body that supports us and is praying for us and walking alongside of us, even if it is kind of digitally. So any other questions? Oh, I saw some. Okay, I'm seeing Terry, so I'll unmute you, and then someone else was just waving their hand. Terry, you can go ahead, and then I'll try to figure out who that was. If you want, you can chat me, whoever you were.
My comment was, first of all, thank you for clarifying on Satan, because I got derailed by that whole thing. So that was very, very helpful. Secondly, I've been told, and I'm very illiterate when it comes to the Bible, that the Bible is all about, in the end, Jesus Christ coming into the world. And the thought crossed my mind, my question is to you, is it really part of a prelude that when God says, Jesus says, you know, to get your new life, you have to give up the old one? That this is an example of that early on, where you're so tied to the material things that, you know, in the end, they're all going to be temporary, and that you have to realize what's important. And I'm not doing a very good job of articulating that, but I'm just trying to tie the whole thing together in terms of, why this? Well, because later on, you're going to find out that if you want to save your life, you have to give this one up. So that's my question. Is it really linked?
Yeah, so I would say yes and no. I say yes, it is definitively linked because Christ is the fullest revelation we have of God. And so we see all things kind of through that prism. I also say Job is a story in and of itself that takes place at least historically before Christ. And so I would advise you to read this in that way, right? We don't want to just completely turn it into a parable on Christ, but we don't want to remove Christ from how we read it. It's both and, if that makes sense. And your point on the kind of leaving the material possessions behind and kind of losing a life to gain a life, I think that's right on. I think we see throughout the book Job at different stages, and those stages of spirituality are different, right? He's essentially growing in some ways, and what precipitates that growth is suffering. And so it's often hard for us, but I mean, think about it in this way. Pam brought this up. All those things that we have lost, we're starting to kind of question, where do we place our meaning? Is our meaning placed on just being able to go out to eat and have kind of the luxuries that we have? Or is it on having healthy family and relationships that we can continue? And so I think you're right on in that. And it doesn't look like a kind of singular change, but a kind of book-wide change for Job.
Thank you.
So thanks. So there was someone else that waved a hand. Aaron, do you see them?
I'll unmute. Just it's so much what you just said is just so much like your book of Lazarus, the suffering, the stages you go through. You really see some parallels right now between what Job's doing.
Yeah, so Pam's referring to a Russian novel we just read over Lent called Loris. And there's 2 copies left in the fellowship hall, I think, if anyone wants one. And I can send notes if you want them. Any other comments, questions before we wrap things up? If you're waving your hand, keep waving it or unmute yourself. Okay, so I just want to point out one thing that I'm thinking about as we walk through this, especially as we walk through it in this kind of larger group, and that is there's a word that's used oftentimes in philosophy to refer to a text as speaking beyond itself, and that is saturated or excessive. We can think about it as revelation, right? God reveals God's self in ways through the text and continues to do so throughout the generations and the different historical contexts and in new ways. And I want you to think of Job in that way, because I will guarantee you we will get to the end of Job and there will be so many different readings of Job. You will see Job different than the person next to you on the screen, or maybe even the person you're watching it alongside. Reading it alongside. The point there is that God is speaking to us through this book. God is speaking to us in different ways through this book. And I don't want you to think about it as competing interpretations, but rather the richness of the text, because Job is such a rich text. And I'm reading Job. I just read through the prologue. I read through it a couple of times this week, but I read through it again this morning. And I was just thinking about how different this is from when I read it a couple of years ago. I read it in the context of Hurricane Irma. And I was like, man, it is so different from how I'm reading it. So be okay with the fact that your interpretation of the text is different, maybe even for yourself, but from those around you. And let that be a guide in our discussion to faithfulness, looking like asking and wrestling with questions rather than kind of coming to a specific answer. By a show of hands, did it, or maybe you could do thumbs up, did it work okay just having a larger question and answer, or would y'all rather have breakout sessions? So thumbs up if you like everyone together. Oh, okay, so we won't do breakout sections, and it looks like everyone enjoys it. Next week, we will be looking at the second discussion section. If you aren't on the email list, please email me at will@palmacia.org. And I will get you on that list and send you the syllabus and the first handout. Let me close us in prayer. Gracious and holy God, we give you thanks for your scripture and specifically for the book of Job and the way it has spoken to countless generations that have suffered and asked questions regarding suffering. We give you thanks especially to the living word and how it speaks to us afresh and anew now. Lord, as we go throughout this class, we just ask that your spirit be present, that it push us, that it challenge us, that it deepen our faith, and that it ultimately draw us closer to you. Help us as we continue to walk through this dark time and to do it in community. For we ask this all in your Son, our Savior's name. Amen. Thank you all so much. And if you have friends that want to join, just give them my email or send it to me. Thank you all for joining us, and I will see you in a week.